can I tell you my truth, little one? How can I tell you the things I have done? Though I cannot see the sky, you know, I only think of you. And you shine for me more brightly than the sun. And how can I tell you I long to be free? Oh, holding you tightly is where I should be. But I had to risk my freedom when injustice called my name. Coming home to you was never up to me.
Welcome everyone. It's so delightful to have you with us today. Baha'i Chat is a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. It's an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas. Each weekly session is rooted in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of humanity, led by individuals putting these principles into action. The song you heard as you were entering the chat today is a new song from the just released documentary Nasrin. It's a remarkable film. I hope you'll all have an opportunity to see it. Nasrin Sotoudeh is a prominent Iranian lawyer and activist who has defended the rights of the Baha'is and virtually every other marginalized group in Iran. For that, she was sentenced to 148 lashes and a second prison term, this time 33 years, under the most harrowing of conditions. Nasrin is directed and produced by Jeff Kaufman, a dear friend who produced and directed the documentary Education Under Fire, used in a campaign by the same title to bring awareness to hundreds of campuses across the United States and Canada about the relentless persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, and especially regarding the Iranian government's refusal to allow Baha'is, its largest non-Muslim population, to attend university since it came to power in 1979, more than 40 years ago. The song, How Can I Tell You, was written for Nasrin by Academy Award nominees and Tony Award winners Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty, and performed by Benin-born singer, activist Angelique Kidjo. Time magazine called Kidjo Africa's premier diva. The film is now being released nationwide. You can find out more by going to nasrinfilm.com. The lyrics of the song is based on heart-wrenching letters that Nasrin wrote to her two young children while in prison. The Baha'i Faith is the youngest of the independent world religions. Its prophet founder, Baha'u'llah, a title meaning the glory of God, claimed to be the promised return anticipated by the Muslim and Christian worlds and alluded to in the sacred scriptures of all of the world's great religions. For this astounding claim, Baha'u'llah gave up the riches and wealth his family had been entitled to and spent some 40 years as a prisoner and exile under the harshest of conditions, during which time he revealed thousands upon thousands of prayers and tablets, much of which has already been translated into some 800 languages. These teachings represent the culmination of spiritual guidance from God to mankind in the world to date. Guidance for a new epoch in human development. Guidance also promised in the scriptures and teachings of every former world religion. The prophets of God who have established the major world religions are connected, according to Baha'i teachings. The structures which have grown up in their respective names, a reality largely created often by the misguided acts of religious leaders, have become divided, disparate systems, struggling with one another, vying for ascendancy. This has never been the plan of God. The founders of the great religions of the world have unfolded truths progressively as the minds of men have been capable of grasping that evolving guidance. I have yet many things to say to you, but ye cannot bear them now, are the words of Jesus Christ recorded in the Gospel of St. John. Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will guide you unto all truth. Today, the Baha'i writings explain God's ultimate purpose is nothing less than the unification of the entire human race, a unity that will finally make clear God's sanctified purpose, a unity that will clear away the religious differences and strife that has plagued mankind since the dawn of time, or at least in our recorded history. A unity expressed in the glory of our diversity, a unity built upon true concern for the well-being of one another, the essential and most fundamental truth advanced in one form or another by every prophet of God, a unity rooted in the progressive increase over generations yet to come of the individual and collective acquisition of the qualities of God, a reality that fulfills the very purpose of our existence in this earthly life, which is preparation for the soul's eternal journey beyond this limited stage of its existence. Current episodes in our twice monthly Baha'i Chat programming focus on issues of racial justice and accord, a fundamental prerequisite, according to Baha'i teachings, to the attainment of world peace and the ultimate goal of the unity of the human race. Here, we attempt to amplify voices of people of color, and especially highlighting relationships where Baha'is are working with collaborators from the wider community, walking the path of racial justice, working together, and experiencing that bond which ultimately comes from mutual service to the will of God. Nothing connects hearts in a more powerful way than when souls see reflected the image of God in the hearts of one another. What trivial differences such as skin color could matter in the least in the face of such a potent force of spiritual love ignited by such shared service? In fact, these bonds of love from the Baha'i perspective are the very foundation of a process required to eliminate racism and every other form of othering. It won't be through contentious struggling or even the passing of legislation that true unity will be realized. We have ample evidences over decades, centuries, and ages that such attempts and measures ultimately fall short of attaining the lofty goal of bringing divided people, let alone uniting the entirety of humankind. In a letter written on July 22nd of this year by the Universal House of Justice, the worldwide governing body of the Baha'i faith, and directed to the Baha'is of the United States, we have this guidance. Ultimately, the power to transform the world is effected by love. Love originating from the relationship with the divine, love ablaze among members of a community, love extended without restriction to every human being. This divine love, ignited by the word of God, is disseminated by enkindled souls through intimate conversations that create new susceptibilities in human hearts and open minds to moral persuasion, and loosen the hold of biased norms and social systems so that they can gradually take on a new form in keeping with the requirements of humanity's age of maturity. The House of Justice goes on to admonish the Baha'is. You are channels for this divine love. Let it flow through you to all who cross your path. Infuse it into every neighborhood and social space in which you move. Today, we have two guests whose relationship, working closely together in the arena of world peace, exemplifies the very essence of this guidance. Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi has held the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, College Park, since 2012. She studies structural racism and the root causes of prejudice, the equality of women as a prerequisite to peace, human nature, global governance, and globalization and the environment. Professor Mahmoudi collaborates with a wide range of scholars, researchers, and practitioners to advance interdisciplinary analysis and open discourse on global peace. Before joining the University of Maryland faculty, she served as the coordinator of the research department at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel. Prior to that, Dr. Mahmoudi was Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern Illinois University, where she was also a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Professor Mahmoudi's books include A World Without War, Abdul-Baha and the Discourse for Global Peace, co-authored with Dr. Janet Khan, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Human Rights and Human Dignity, co-edited with Michael Penn, and Children and Globalization, Multidisciplinary Perspectives, co-edited with Stephen Mintz. In 2021, She'll be publishing a co-edited volume titled The Changing Ethos of Human Rights. I know she'd be embarrassed that I shared all of this with you, but Hoda, welcome to the chat.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. And I really look forward to today's program.
Well, we're delighted to have you, and joining you today is Mr. Malik Wilson. Mr. Wilson is visiting faculty fellow at the University of Maryland. He previously was a research fellow at American University in Washington, D.C. He's received awards and commendations from the Humanities Council of Washington, D.C., the City Book Society, Writer's Line. His studies examine themes of exile in American and Western culture, and we're so delighted to have him with us today. Malik, welcome to the chat.
Thank you, David. I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you. And in fact, what I'd like to do is actually start with you, Malik. During our tech run through, you spoke a bit about your very interesting family and the impact that they've had on you. So to talk a little bit about this, get us started.
Sure. So I'm going to do a quick rundown the four grandparent lines. So my mother's family, my mother's mother, they came from Alabama by way of Arkansas to Little Rock, and my grandmother went to Missouri after that, where she met my grandfather, who she outperformed in the college that they attended, much to his chagrin. His people were from Missouri, and their ancestor goes back to a gentleman who appears in the 1870 census, and was a homesteader, and so went to Missouri. We're not sure where he came from, but went to Missouri and was able to get some land there, land that's still in our family. And my mother's side of the family were working people who also valued education very much and pushed their children. They were also religious believers and big churchgoers. And when my grandfather came back with his fiance, they weren't too pleased that they had plans to go to the nightclub. And so my mother loves to tell that story. But just solid people on her side of the family. On my father's side of the family, my father's father, sort of a great, wonderful, great migration story. They were from South Carolina, and his father got on a train with his young bride and said to the man, "Take me as far north as this ticket, as I can afford." And so they ended up in Connecticut, and eventually came further south to Baltimore and then to Philadelphia, finally to Washington, D.C. My father's, where he met my father's mother. And on her side of the family, very interesting, there's an ancestor that we've traced all the way back to the mid-19th century, to actually about the 1820s or so. And there was a gentleman named Mr. Muhammad who came from Madagascar, came to Virginia, we believe, married a woman who was a slave, was able to purchase her freedom, and just a really interesting story there. His descendant is a man named James Monroe Gregory, and he was one of the first in the class, first graduating class at Howard University, and ended up teaching Latin there. His son, T. Montgomery Gregory, went to Harvard in 1910, and then also came to Howard as a 24-year-old professor. My mother loves to tell the story about the Deltas. It's a famous African-American sorority who were very active in the women's voting movement. But Howard University at the time said, well, you can march, but you have to have someone to, escort you. So of all the professors, they asked my great grandfather, very handsome man. And at 24, my mother always giggles about that story. But my family has been closely involved in education, that side of the family, and also in Washington, D.C. and Howard University too.
I know there was a connection somewhere along the line with Frederick Douglass, wasn't there?
That's right. So that's James Monroe Gregory, who was friends with both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, and was involved in a lot of the struggle for civil rights and for upliftment of the community, as was his son. So,
what a family history to be proud of. It's wonderful.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you for sharing that. Hoda, I'd like to circle back to Nasrin Sotoudeh for just a minute. As an Iranian woman yourself, a Baha'i deeply empathetic to the sufferings the Baha'is have faced since the birth of the faith, when some 20,000 early believers were put to death in the most horrible manner in a decade's time, and certainly with respect to the persecutions now under the current regime in Iran. What is it about a sister Iranian, an attorney, a human rights activist, defender of the marginalized that really resonates with you?
That's a very good question and a very difficult one to answer, because although I don't know Miss Sotoudeh, what I see emanating from her is this human spirit, the best that the human spirit has to offer. Her utter selfless approach to her work as a lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, which she has to be one of the best in the world to have gotten this kind of attention from her government to begin with, who wants to, imprison her and keep her, if you will, quiet. The best of lawyers that there are in relation to human rights. But beyond that, it's her humanity. It's who she is as a human being that really shines for all of us to try to emulate. She defends anyone. She doesn't care about background, whether it's class, religion, gender, etc., etc. At a time when supporting Baha'is in Iran as a lawyer is not a very safe thing to do, she has come to the defense of the Baha'is, as well as all other Iranians. And her, the way she carries herself as a mother, as a wife, and then as this professional woman who has so much to offer to her society, she is really an epitome of what, especially I would say, women all around the world should look up to, because she shows us how each of us has a role to play in terms of bringing a more just society into being, and in terms of just how to treat other human beings with utter dignity and openness.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Malik, tell us a little bit about when you started working with the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, kind of what drew you to the work and what the process has been like for you.
Sure. Well, I came to Hoda by way of CATS for my last boss at American University. Introduced me to another professor, a colleague of Hoda's, who occasionally needed cat sitting and who I was in the neighborhood for. And so that's how that relationship started. And I think it originally began as, I would say, mostly some editing work and so forth. But I think as time went on, both Hoda and I began to see that there were many similarities in how we viewed the world, that there were overlapping values, a sense of trying to understand the spiritual nature of things and not just the material nature, of wanting to find the university as a locale where all forms of knowledge could be pursued. And then at some point, I think just becoming friends, which in turn sort of rebounds back to the work and creates a kind of an intimacy. That has just been a tremendous process, intellectually and personally, as well as spiritually. So it's been a great kind of tandem connection, and over time I've come to know more about Hoda, but also more about her beliefs and her faiths, and that of the Baha'i faith as well.
Hoda, in the description you provided for the session, you referred to the simple civilization of friendship, never heard of that put quite that way, as a self-sustaining reality. So if both of you sort of expand on that a bit.
Well, we hear a lot of talk about civilization building. And oftentimes I think that is kind of a vague concept. But I think civilization building, meaning trying to establish something that will support all of humanity in a manner which is kind, progressive, that offers the best to all of humanity. I think it starts with friendship. I think it starts with the connections that human beings make with one another. And in relation to this simple civilization of friendship, this concept that we wanted to talk about, friendship is not easy. And I think this is a good example to take in relation to what it takes to really try to build a different world, if you will. Friendship requires that we be patient, that we perhaps listen more than we talk, that we take the time that is required to cultivate something, to tend to something that's very important. It's really a very private human endeavor, which has nothing to do with the loudness, if I can put it that way, that we hear in society these days, that, let's get together and let's get to know each other and then everything will be fine from there on. No, it isn't like that. It's hard work to become a true friend to another person. And I think what is important about the process relates to not only peace in the world, but Malik and I started our process of friendship very much from a professional stance. Mm-hmm. But we began to talk about ideas that were secular, ideas that were spiritual. And through those ideas, we began to learn something about each other. And we began to unravel mysteries about each other. And mysteries that even to this day, I would say I don't fully know Malik. And I may never end up knowing Malik, which is the beauty of friendship, because it's an adventure. It's an adventure. And I think in that adventure, to have an open heart, to be sincere about our motives are extremely important. And I think, and Malik will carry on with this, but I think for me, when we talk about racial justice, race unity, I think this concept of the simple civilization of friendship, that's where it has to begin. That's the starting point of this adventure.
I fully concur. I love what Hoda said about friendship being a private human endeavor. And I think one thing that we often talk about is that it's easier not to do that. It takes, there's a cost to making oneself vulnerable, and obviously on a grand level, we can sort of ask what that looks like, but all of us have ways to pursue that privately and locally. And there are people who are in need of that, and we're in need of that. And I think I think I would just add one of the fascinating things, and Hoda touched on it, and it's something I would say that's not sort of well enough described in the academic literature or the spirit of the moment, is the way in which the personal and the professional run together, and the academic, the intellectual, and the spiritual sort of run together. And that the way that happens, I think Hoda alluded to gardening, and just the tending of that. There's a mystery to it. We know how photosynthesis works, but there's still a mystery to how all these things grow. And I think what Hoda's talking about is there's a rich cultivation space that happens between human beings. And that is something that's precious and good for those human beings and for the world as well.
Hoda, I think in one of the articles you wrote, you talk about the deeper issues of the day sort of being worked through in the crucible of that simple civilization of friendship. I love the phrase. How does that work?
That's a very good question, because that's exactly what Malik and I face constantly. You know, it's I don't know. It's I don't know how to describe it well, but I'll try. The issue is, I think one has to first accept the fact. I have to first accept the fact that I don't know everything. That there's much that I need to learn, and therefore you take this attitude of learning, which is also very exciting, because when you want to learn about something, it's a wonderful exploration of things unknown and new things that you gain. And with Malik, it has been this sort of exploration. Very difficult topics, sometimes on race, oftentimes that he and I have been involved in. And, he will say, oh, but I think this should have happened, and I don't think that this is a good thing that has happened. And I will listen to him, and I will, of course, very much respect what he has to say and his perspective. But there are moments where both of us get to the point where we realize, or I realize, for example, that I don't fully agree with him. That I think what he just said, I just can't totally agree with it. Now, I could just back off and go my way. But usually, because there is this friendship and this trust between us, we can talk about things that we disagree about on racial matters. And that's when we have this friction, if you will, this moment of dissonance, that's when we really learn from each other. Because then by listening to each other pose our own perspectives, we begin to enter a whole new world of understanding. And this happens with Malik and I repeatedly.
This is such a great question, David. And I think, that there's a number of ways to look at it. In some ways, I think friendship gives you a structure. This is the simple civilization part. It sort of gives you a controlled experiment with boundaries, whereby you can sort of fling the particles of exploration, at sort of the metal shield, as it were, of the structure of the friendship. And in doing so together, you can sort of look and see what happens. I think maybe that's part of what Hoda's talking about in that clash. This is how you understand things. You throw particles at a wall and you trace the lines. And one of the challenging things that both she and I often discuss is we talk about sort of quantum physics as this metaphor, right? And that there are really weird things that show up in quantum physics, things that, we wish weren't true, because they make the science that much more difficult. And it means going back to the drawing board. It means that our standard model doesn't fit. And that is, that stinks. That means, we need new conceptions of things and new approaches to things. But I think in general, the structure is, as you said, the simple civilization of friendship gives you a home base that you can launch out from and into the world. And you can do the heroic and the courageous things, because you're confident that at the end of the day you can return back to a space that's safe and comforting.
Well, talking about difficult subjects, let's talk a little bit about the whole question of racial equality. What's going on right now? Things have become so heated and really sort of come to a head. Of course, we know I think in the scriptures of all of certainly the Abrahamic traditions, and very clearly in the Baha'i writings, reaching a place of unity requires first and foremost this equity that must occur. And we know that it's inevitable. It's going to happen. It's only a question of how long it'll take, how much pain we have to go through till we figure it out. It'll be a lot less painful to do it than to combat it. But so, Malik, what are your thoughts? I mean, we know we're going to get there. What are your thoughts on how are we going to get there? How do we do this thing? How does it manifest? You were talking about difficult questions. I thought I'd throw one to you.
Throw me right into the deep end.
There you go.
No, that's a great question, and this is wouldn't you say, Hoda? This is one of the things we talk about a whole lot. And this is one of the interesting things that I've come to respect and appreciate about the Baha'i faith as well. Understanding the sort of the vision, both sort of as an eschatology, but also the practical and the moral vision. And I always say to Hoda that sometimes I need her to remind me of that, because it is very different than the world views equity. And
we should clarify that you're a friend of the faith, but you are not yourself a Baha'i. We should mention.
Right. That's correct. Right. That's correct. So, I would, the short answer to that, David, is that process for me of sort of feeling my way through, and sometimes I tease Hoda and I blame her. I say, you've made all these things so much more difficult since I met you, but that's a sign of clashing with a great mind and a moral vision. So I guess the best way for me to sort of answer that briefly, and I know we're going to dive into these things, is to say one thing that Hoda has reminded me of in working at the Baha'i Chair has sort of underlined is this idea that the issues of the day, that human beings are essentially spiritual. And if human beings are essentially spiritual in their core, it's not that material things don't matter. It's just that there are other things that matter and other ways that they matter. And if that's true, then that also gives us a different way of looking at human accomplishment. And this is something that I see even in thinking about my own family, or the experience of African American. And I think maybe perhaps even Hoda's interest in some of those subjects. At the end of the day, it's not a sort of a modern take on equity, but it's more her saying, how did these people accomplish these things, almost from a spiritual perspective? How are they able to succeed and maintain themselves and have a vision of faith and community and family and nation? How did that happen? A fundamental sort of spiritual curiosity, which in turn has rebounded back to me and given me a lot more work, David, because the question then for me becomes, what does accomplishment, racial accomplishment, spiritual accomplishment look like? And if that's true, how do we judge what's equitable? This is back to your question, because in that line of thinking, the people who seem to be suffering might not be suffering as much as those who appear to be doing a lot better. And that's, I'll just put that in there.
I think Malik did a perfect job. I don't know that I can add much more. I think that the thing he just said about sometimes who we think is a victim. I mean, maybe they're a victim in one way, but if we look closer, we see that those people are really the ones who understand better what a human being is about.
Pupil of the eye.
Pupil of the eye, as is the Baha'i description of the wonderful contribution that the African Americans can give to this world. So, this is so important, because with the hustle and bustle of the media and social media as well, and all the ways that we are now talking to each other, which is basically, in my view, we're just shouting to each other. There's not much talking going on. There's not much communication going on these days. There's so much hatred in the air that stepping back and looking at how, for me, how this community of Africans who came to America under the most awful circumstances, they have amazing model of strength, fortitude, and holding together. I'm not trying to ignore the realities that are there. I'm aware of them. I'm a sociologist, I know. But if you look at it from that historical perspective, they have managed to hold their dignity and respect despite anything that has been constantly hurled at them. To me, that's the model that I want to be interested in. That's what I want to know about.
You know, I wonder when I read the writings on the whole notion of pupil of the eye, you know, that could sound on the surface like, you know, a lovely sort of moniker or whatever, but it just, I just wonder if it's not sort of in the crucible of the struggle that, you know, real character and real depth of vision and insight happens. And I, you know, just having the pleasure as a Baha'i to know so many folks of color and, you know, those that are leading the charge in this whole arena, it's, you know, sometimes really amazing to hear the things that come out of their minds and their hearts. It's not just a lovely expression. It really has some depth to it.
I totally agree with you. And I think it's really important, again, when I say that I want to know more about this community that is so full of strength and fortitude, again, it's not to single them out. You know, this is not it's not an observation of a population. No, that's not what it is. Perhaps it's more like a Nasrin Sotoudeh and the women of Iran, who, under the most difficult of circumstances, these women consistently stand up for their rights and say, all we're asking is that you just allow us some freedom. We don't want anything else. We'll follow the laws, but we just want some freedom. And they do it nonviolently. In the same way, I think the African Americans in this country, I think we whites have a lot to learn from them. Because the point is, and I'll speak as a mother now, I have a son. If my son experiences a hardship or some struggle in his life, I'd like him to have the skills to overcome that hardship as painlessly as possible and to move on, because life is about hardship and suffering. Life cannot be free of that. And so anytime we can learn from anyone the example of how to get through the rough times, then there's a lot of lesson there to learn. And I think this goes back to the pupil of the eye, in that certain people just know more, see better, understand better.
Let's talk a little bit about this sort of 400-year period of systemic or structural racism. I mean, it is, I'm sure, in terms of what you have been looking at together, this is really, you know, just a very difficult thing to imagine the undoing of. What are your thoughts about that?
Obviously, this is a huge question, and something that Hoda has been working on for years. I think one reason that I'm very happy and proud to be associated with the chair is that she's been doing this work. The chair has been doing this work for years, even before it has been as discussed. And I enjoy Hoda's practice of what that looks like, because I think her, and she can talk a little bit about it, her vision of how to break down systemic racism, and you alluded to this too, David, isn't just to pass a law, but it's work. It's to roll up your sleeves and put on the kitchen cleaning gloves and ask for overtime. And, you know, that's just sort of what it is. And I think I would, and if I'm speaking too much for you, Hoda, you can interject here, but I think in that vision of it, the people who are qualified to do the work are also the people who want to show up and do the work, whoever they are. You know, who's going to show up at 6 a.m. to do the work. And I think that I think that's a good way of framing that. I always think of the metaphor of, you know, for the military when they in the years of doing different types of advertising, they say they always get more people when they say, this is the toughest job you're ever going to have, but you'll be better for it. And you if you feel the call, you need to come do this work. More so than trying to convince people how good it is and how easy it'll be and how quick it'll happen. And so I guess I would say, David, that first, I think, is a recognition that the work is long and difficult, and you may not see the end of it. And I think that also ties to the Baha'i vision of what this work should be like. I don't know if Hoda, you wanted to talk about that as well.
Yes, I think, you know, we talk about systemic racism a lot, and clearly there is, you know, Malik and I talk about this. Systems, if you will, bureaucracies have a tendency to become lazy, to become lethargic. And the goal of the people in these systems is to prevent that lethargy from creeping in. Mm. And now I'm talking about systemic racism. So if we look around our organization and we see, oh, who's missing? And why is that? Then we need to get out of our laziness and begin to address that question and to right that deficiency that we see in our organization. So it's, you know, I don't want to pretend that it's easy, because it's not. It requires constant reminder, but beyond that, it requires that every opening, every job opening, if the applicants aren't diverse enough, then I'm sorry, those in charge need to go look for that diversity. They need to go find it, because sometimes it's hard for some people to apply for certain jobs because maybe they already think that I don't have a chance in this organization. And, you know, in large part, they're right. So this is where I think what Malik was saying is hard work. It's constant reminder of what are we missing, what are we lacking, and going after it. And I would tell you, honestly, universities and colleges are one of the most difficult places. And I know this because fortunately, when I became associate deans and assistant deans, the reason I did that is because the person who wanted me to work in that capacity was interested in bringing more diversity of students or faculty or staff to our campuses. And it just isn't easy. Whether it was in California, where we were trying to bring in the children of migrants in Southern California to be at our university, and that what it took was to hire the right kind of people to go and talk to the parents of those children and say, your daughter and son should be going to college. How can we help for them to succeed and bring them to our institution? Or another place in Midwest, in rural Michigan, one of the toughest jobs I've ever had at Olivet College. We actually, in 3 years, it significantly changed the entire makeup of that college in terms of student enrollment, students of color, and faculty. But boy, I some of these gray hairs also come from that time. So, it's constant, and this is not just me, I'm not talking about me. It's the institution that had to struggle. And lots of people in that institutions made it possible for this to happen. But Systemic racism means that we have to stop being lazy about how we do the things that we do in whatever organization we work for. And this is, I think, basically the hardest work there is to do, but at some level, it's also not that hard, but it requires constant thinking, consciousness about what needs to be done.
You provided a few quotes that really speak to this conversation, and there's one in particular. Racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life while blighting the progress of the rest of humanity. It cannot be rooted out by contest and conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift and not designate anyone as other.
I think I'll draw back to one of the things I mentioned earlier, which is just, and this is sort of a Baha'i approach, that even before we sort of begin to talk about race, that, and this is something that Hoda talks about all the time, sort of looking at people how God sees them, which is a wonderful idea. But putting that into practice all the time, from the personal to the systemic, man, that is there's a lot to that. You know, that's not just the guy that cuts you off while you're driving, but it's your family, it's people who you're pretty sure have some of the stupidest ideas that have ever been, you know, voiced. But what does it mean to look at this person as a creation, in a sense, of God? You know, you talk about some work. There's some work in that. And then what does that look like when it comes to race? You know, David, going back to some of, I think, a point that we touched on before, and Hoda sort of talked about sort of cultural accomplishment. This is a place where we sort of diverge at times, because one of the things that Hoda's helped me with is to be sort of more willing to talk about these experiences and these sort of cultural understandings and truths, because I think there's a spirit in and maybe with other sort of immigrant cultures, but there's certainly a spirit in African American culture, which is sort of like, I'm not going to tell you anything, you know. You don't need to know these things, and you don't need to know the beautiful things in particular. We'll tell you this. We'll tell you the bad stuff because, you know, you should feel bad, or because you're part of it, or you need to know what happened. But we're not going to tell you the lovely things, because that's ours. You know, it's sort of like, you took everything else, you're not going to take that.
Wow.
And one of the ways that the simple civilization of my friendship with Hoda has sort of pushed me to sort of realize that I had some of those feelings at times, and I, you know, and to kind of begin the process of rethinking that. Because I think for Hoda, for Baha'is, I think from what I've learned is that this notion of sort of a unified humanity by race and by, you know, every other measure is going to need the genius of every community. And that it's forced me into a bit of a moral quandary to say, what does it look like if any one of those groups stands on the hill and says, you can't have what we have. This is private, stop. Now, there are things that we need to keep for ourselves individually and maybe culturally. I don't know. But it would seem to me that even before we start talking about race, and this is something that, you know, we're always coming back to, we have to sort of look at what's deeper than that, what's deeper than race, what endures, you know, what's really true. Otherwise, we're going to just be sort of rearranging the cans on the wall, and we'll never kind of rebuild the house, as it were.
Let's circle back for just a minute. Josefina, could you put up again the quote from the House of Justice? Ultimately, the power to transform the world is affected by love, love originating from the relationship with the divine, love ablaze among members of a community, love extended without restriction to every human being. We talked a little bit about that. This divine love ignited by the word of God, disseminated by enkindled souls through intimate conversations that create new susceptibility in human hearts, open minds to moral persuasion, loosen the hold of biased norms and social systems so they can gradually take on a new form in keeping with the requirements of humanity's age of maturity. What are some of the steps you think that individuals, that we can take to begin to act in accordance with that guidance? I mean, these are very lofty ideas, and you've helped, I think, to a large degree, bring it down to earth here. So what can we do? Like, what are some specific thoughts and ideas on that?
David, I think just as I talked about lethargy and laziness in systems, I think we individuals can have the same problem. And so for me, it's who comes over to my place? Who do I interact with? Who do I hang out with? Who am I learning from? Who am I exposing myself to who are different than me? And what can I learn from them?
Who am I being vulnerable with?
Exactly. Who am I being vulnerable with? Absolutely. So it's, and in a sense, it's not about me. It's really about what I can gain by interacting with people who are not necessarily like me, and I think it requires, again, getting out of our lethargy, removing the laziness and meeting people who are not like us, who we don't typically interact with. I think one of the gravest problems right now that we face, at least I'll speak for America, you've heard it. We're talking in an echo chamber, right? That we always talk to people who are like us. I think this is the most dangerous thing we can do. And in life, to guard against this is the most important thing, but it's hard because the tendency is to hang out with people who are most like us, who eat the same food we like, who think the same things we think, whatever. And so to really show that we love humanity for what it is to show that we love humanity for what it is. In other words, get out there and meet as many different people as possible. And I don't think this is difficult. I just think it requires, just as systemic racism requires it, it requires that we get out of that echo chamber, if you will, and meet new people and different people and learn from them and learn that, we have much more in common than not. And from there, we began conversations like
Right.
Malik and I have, that has led to this wonderful friendship, which I can't tell you how much he has taught me. Anyway.
I love this. Malik.
I have been to Hoda's house. I have to tell everybody on listening that I have been to her house, and what a wonderful time it is. And that's when the magic happens. And so often, and I'll circle back to your point directly, but one thing that does is something happens in the exchange that's more than the sum of its parts. And I don't know if it's before the rice or after the rice, before the coffee, before the dessert, the drive home, the drive there. When I come back to my little abode, some of the looming shadows have come down. And I think one of the challenges, one of the things to embrace is one's essential neediness and one's essential tendency to hit one's head on the walls and to come to the limits of oneself. And that is a difficult process, and I think can be difficult to admit. And it's one reason why, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but I think nominating a particular sex or particular race or particular nation as the sort of the ones who need to educate, as a woman, I need to educate, or as an African American. One of the problems that for me with that is that it takes away my ability to tend to say, I don't know, you know, because then I begin to feel like I need to have answers to everything. And when I'm in that mode, and I think I have great answers. I wish everyone listened to me. I'm sure the world would be better. You know, I think we all feel like that. Well, at least I do. But when I'm thinking like that, I am not learning new things. I am not on the frontiers of my own understanding and getting into the deep things of the world. It's only when I say, you know, what the heck is all this stuff about? And I need some help. I need some friends. I need some rice and some coffee and some dessert to work through these things. And so I think it requires not just a curiosity, David, but also a kind of a moral desperation that says, if I don't have this, you know, woe unto me. And, you know, that can be tough.
Well, I don't want to make this sound like the end, because it's just a break and it's not the end. But in case anybody has to go off, the first thing I'd like to do is just really thank both of you, Malik and Hoda. This has been a very rich and just a wonderful conversation. You've really brought a dimension to Baha'i Chat, and we're just so delighted to have you here.